Dear friends, I realized a little while ago that the story of my criminal case, that is the criminal case behind which the criminals in German politics, the mainstream media, and the legal system tried to hide the true story of my abduction for political persecution, needed to be summarized so that it becomes easy to understand. My 165 or 66-page criminal complaint and even my roughly 40-page long civil complaint doesn't quite serve that purpose. So here comes the long and the short of it, understandable without any legal terminology. The short of it is, in October of 2023, the German government abducted, that is, kidnapped me in Mexico with the help of the German Domestic Intelligence Service, CPA, that's Constitutional Protection Agency, and the German equivalent of the FBI called BKA. The reason for this is threefold. One, they wanted to shut me up so that I wouldn't be able to investigate the corona pandemic and tell the international public about the results. Two, they wanted to make it impossible for me to run for public office. You know, back then I was the leader of a German party, the only party that was highly critical of the government's actions. And three, last but not least, they wanted to threaten the international public who was following my work into submission. If we can do it to him, we can do it to you too. None of this has worked. Now comes the long of it. The following gives you a short introduction into what I have done in Germany and the U.S., that is the state of California, as a trial lawyer, since I'd been admitted to the bar in Germany and in California in 1993. Then comes a more detailed account of my work as an attorney, but also as a political activist since the start of the pandemic in 2020, and how the criminal actors of the deep state have tried to take me down and shut me up starting in August of 2021. It all culminated in my abduction in Mexico so that I could be charged with a fake crime and sentenced to basically life imprisonment. I'm not kidding you. That is at least what the intention of the monsters behind this is. Sentence me to, without even having a prior record, sentence me, up until then, a successful international lawyer, to more than 4 years as a first installment and another 5 years for another fake crime as a second installment, and so on and so on. That has failed abjectly and even backfired, as has now become clear, as the entire deep state system is collapsing everywhere and in full panic mode. So the following is probably, depending on how fast I talk, probably an hour and 15 minutes or so, but if you want to read the transcript of this, it'll be faster because you can skip anything that you're not really interested in. First of all, if you want to know where I went to school in Germany and in the United States, and where I went to law school in Germany and in the United States, at what universities I taught law, and how much and what I published in terms of books and law review articles, and when I joined the Army for officers training and then left, please see my curriculum vitae. This is going to be attached to this. So, after I finished law school, first in Germany and then in the state of California, I was admitted to the bar both in the state of California and in Germany in 1993. Both with my law firm in Germany, which employed some 17 attorneys plus 12 or 13 paralegals, secretaries, IT people, and people in bookkeeping, and in the U.S., I have always represented consumers and small and medium-sized businesses, the backbones of both the German and the United States economies. From 1985 until 2001, I also taught law at various universities. And at the University of Göttingen, I specialized in medical and pharmaceutical law, and I have some 15 years of experience in that field. My and my colleagues' area, I'm talking about my firm, my law firm now, of expertise has always been tort law, which is one of the two most important aspects of civil law, the other being the law of contracts. That means, tort law means that we represented consumers and small and medium-sized businesses against large, usually highly criminal and highly corrupt global corporations, such as banks like Deutsche Bank, the German car maker VW, and the world's largest shipping company, Kühne and Nagel. We sued them for damages because of the damage they caused our clients. For example, through predatory lending practices in the context of the financing of junk real estate, which caused what is still remembered as the Lehman crash in 2008 or 9, I believe, meaning first a real estate crisis in the United States, then a worldwide banking crisis, and then a worldwide economic crisis and a euro crisis. We sued VW because of their diesel fraud, and we sued Kühne and Nagel because of corruption, meaning that they had bribed an employee of our client, a furniture maker from Bavaria, so that this employee would only use them, Kühne and Nagel, and no other shipping company, ship the furniture from Asia to Bavaria. The bribe money was created by overcharging our client, the furniture maker, which eventually drove them into bankruptcy. But I also did pro bono work. The most important one of those cases was one that a very good friend of mine, a prominent German mainstream TV journalist, asked me to take. This is more than 20 years ago. He asked me to represent survivors of ritual child abuse, and he at the same time would tell their stories on public television. So I would go to the courts of law to represent them, and he would tell their stories on public television. I managed to get some of the visible perpetrators put in jail, but then all of a sudden, mainstream media television decided that the stories of these survivors were simply too much for their audiences. My then wife wanted me to stop doing that work and instead focus on what she called the real cases, and that was the end of that for a long time. Through my friend, the journalist, I became acquainted with a senior police officer who, as the leader of a special task force, had been investigating a German terrorist cell consisting of 2 young men and their female companion who had been posting videos in which they seemed to be preparing for attacks on non-European immigrants. Now, this is before the floodgates for uncontrolled immigration were opened by Angela Merkel in 2015. So we're talking about legal immigrants who were well integrated into German society. When my new friend, the police officer, and his task force had finally located the place where these 3 people, who called themselves NSU, were actually building bombs and they tried to arrest them, the German Domestic Intelligence Service, CPA, Constitutional Protection Agency, appeared and told the police to let them go, as these people were their agents. Almost immediately afterwards, in 2002 or 2003, the 3 of them went on a more than 10-year killing spree, killing 10 people, 9 of them immigrants, and 1 of them who didn't quite seem to fit the pattern, a female police officer. She has a story of her own, but I will not get into this right now. This is the first time that I became suspicious of this domestic intelligence service, the CPA, Constitutional Protection Agency. In the meantime, many books, none of them flattering to that outfit, have been written about the CPA, one of them by a former German politician. With this in mind, and with what we now know about their special role in demonizing, for example, the most popular German party, and in my abduction and political persecution, I have a very solid factual basis for not just calling them a rogue intelligence service, but a German domestic terrorist organization. Then, in March of 2020, the pandemic started. My wife Inka and I had been traveling back and forth between Germany and our ranch in Northern California for years before the pandemic even started. We had bought the ranch because when I met Inka in 2008, I was caught in a bad marriage and had been working more or less around the clock to not have to address the problem of that bad marriage. I was in court almost every day. Sometimes I would try a case in Frankfurt against Deutsche Bank in the morning and another one in Stuttgart in the afternoon against a Bavarian bank. So when I met Inka, she and I decided to slowly but surely wind things down so that we could have a real life for ourselves. We sold off 5 pieces of real property, and we decided to downsize my firm from 17 lawyers to, I believe, 4 or 5 when the pandemic struck. A senior lawyer, a woman who had been with me for more than 20 years, was running things in Germany in close cooperation with me. We spoke on the phone almost every day and communicated via email and chat messages constantly. I flew back to Germany whenever we thought that to be necessary because an important case was being tried, a case in which either the client or I believed that I shouldn't delegate it but try it myself. One very important case was against Deutsche Bank, my former employer in Tokyo, Japan. And it was very important because for the first time, it looked as though we would be able to truly expose the lies which 6 German district courts had either been not able or unwilling to see through, and because of which we had lost many cases. This time was different, as this time the case was being tried at the appellate court in Hamburg before a judge who, a long time ago, had been a banker himself, just like I had been a banker, not a lawyer, banker for Deutsche Bank in Tokyo in the 1990s. And this judge, just like I, had experienced this in Tokyo, must have been aware of the criminal practices of Deutsche Bank, criminal practices that had earned DB, Deutsche Bank, the title of Bank of the Criminals, and which had cost them billions and billions of dollars in fines, mostly in the U.S. So when Deutsche Bank once again presented their best liar as a witness in that trial, the judge simply cut him off when he once again embarked on his trail of lies and told him that if he went any further, he would hand that civil case for damages over to the DA's office to have them criminally investigate the criminal liar and Deutsche Bank itself. We won that case, and the decision was so well written that Deutsche Bank didn't even dare appeal that case to the Supreme Court. This opened the doors for more than 6,000 clients of ours who had been waiting in the wings for Deutsche Bank's lies to be officially exposed so that they could then finally, now that the fog had cleared, have us file civil complaints for damages for them too. In fact, things looked pretty good. As a few years before this is in 2020, 2021 or so. A few years before this, I had approached a friend at Deutsche Bank, someone who had basically trained me before I went to Tokyo for Deutsche Bank, but in the meantime had climbed up the career ladder and become a member of the managing level directly below the CEO. And I had presented, because of the lies, and I told him, look, this is going to blow up. I had presented a settlement proposal to Deutsche Bank for our thousands of clients, all of whom were victims of Deutsche Bank's predatory lending for junk real estate. And I asked him for a lump payment of, 400 or 450 million euros for our more than 6,000 clients. He promised to discuss this with Deutsche Bank's then CEO, who happened to have been my former boss in Tokyo, but I never heard from him, my friend, again. However, I had also filed a so-called Amicus Curiae brief against Deutsche Bank in 2017 in a class action case against Deutsche Bank that was pending before a Southern California court. As a friend of the court, that's what Amicus Curiae means, friend of the court, I informed the court that Deutsche Bank then, when they commit a tort or crime, they usually do it not just negligently, but intentionally, because they're the bank of the criminals. And I attached evidence of several criminal investigations that my firm and I had started against Deutsche Bank by filing criminal complaints. If you're interested in what I wrote, I'm attaching that Amicus Curiae brief to this piece of information as well. That was meant to give the court the opportunity to not just think about simple monetary damages, but to also ponder punitive damages against Deutsche Bank. That's what you can ask for. And there is an intentional, as opposed to negligent, intentional infliction of harm. That was huge, as the so-called amount in controversy, that's the amount which the plaintiffs claimed Deutsche Bank owed them in damages, was $85 billion. A few weeks later, I gave a speech at Deutsche Bank's annual shareholder meeting before thousands of shareholders explaining about the massive judgment that was to be expected from that Southern California court and which could very well mean the end for Deutsche Bank. The board of supervisors and their CEO plus managing directors that were all sitting on the stage pretended to not even listen. But a few weeks later, Deutsche Bank settled the case for an undisclosed amount of money. It cannot have been cheap. It is this backdrop against which my firm and I were getting ready to now launch a full frontal attack against Deutsche Bank in Germany's courts of law, when Inka and I learned of the pandemic at our ranch in Northern California. In April and in May of 2020, I had posted a few short 5 to 10 minute long videos on YouTube on why I, both as a tort lawyer and someone with a little bit of experience in medical and pharmaceutical law, believed that there was something wrong with that pandemic, trying to remind the viewers of these videos of the Roman legal saying, audiatur et ultra pars, which means listen also to the other side. As that other side existed, of course, there's lots of scientists and others who began to speak out, but they seemed to be drowned out by the official narrative. And I also reminded them of follow the money, to explain that those who were pushing the pandemic or the pandemic's official narrative might have a financial interest in getting people to panic and do whatever the creators of that narrative wanted them to do, including ultimately, of course, take those untested vaccines. When Inka finally asked me in late May or early June of 2020 to return to Germany with our dogs, at least for a couple of months, and hold a conference over an extended weekend with all those people who I had met during my time in medical and pharmaceutical law, I had organized many of those international conferences at the University of Göttingen. I decided that's not a bad idea, because the idea behind this is, of course, to make both politicians and the mainstream media in Germany become aware of the mistakes which I thought they were making. And I agreed. Not just because I thought this to be a good idea, but also because I agreed with the lawyers at my firm that now was the time to really go after Deutsche Bank after that ruling, that perfect ruling, so that our clients would eventually see justice. But before we went to Germany, I called Dr. Wolfgang Wodak, whom I knew from my time working for the NGO Transparency International, an anti-corruption NGO where I led the working group for justice and law, trying to introduce a real law of evidence and class actions into the German legal system. Wolfgang connected me with Viviane Fischer, as I felt that it wouldn't be a bad idea to have at least one other lawyer on board, because I would be pretty busy arguing those cases against DB. And I had not been able to find any other lawyer who had, at that point in time, was willing to stick their neck out. So I met with her in early June in Berlin, but both she and Wolfgang, who had joined us via Zoom and who, of course, had been in Germany all the time while I had been in the United States, both of them immediately said that they thought that a conference over an extended weekend wouldn't cut it, as both German politicians and German mainstream media by that time lashing out almost viciously at anyone who dare criticize the crazy anti-corona measures. So Viviane and I agreed to do what the Bundestag should have done, that is set up the Corona Investigative Committee on that very day in early or mid-June of 2020, which would then look into basically three questions that I thought that not just us, but also our viewers might be interested in. One, how dangerous was that virus really? If you believe that viruses exist, which many people doubt now, then it was no more dangerous than the common flu, a mild flu actually, as even the WHO had to finally admit in accordance with the findings of Professor John Ioannidis of Stanford University. 2, how reliable is the PCR test when it comes to diagnosing infections? Not reliable at all, as it turned out. Its inventor, Nobel laureate Dr. Kary Mullis, had in fact over and over stated that it was neither designed nor admitted for diagnostic purposes, and that's also what it said on the inserts of its packages, not authorized for diagnostic purposes. Worse still, the so-called German scientist, whom the now infamous monster Dr. Fauci kept referring to when pushing the PCR test as the gold standard for diagnosing COVID infections, had written an article which led to massive, deliberate misuse of the PCR test in order to create cases that didn't exist. By the way, the same thing that had been done in order to create the AIDS pandemic in the early 1980s. Now, this German scientist is Professor Dr. Drosten, who, as we found out, is neither a real doctor nor real professor, but who closely cooperated with Fauci in the now infamous gain-of-function experiments in order to make viruses more dangerous for humans. Again, I want to point out to you that many highly regarded scientists and medical doctors now believe that viruses do not even exist. But we're either talking about exosomes or something else, toxins that make people sick. In that case, all the talk about gain of function would, of course, only serve one purpose, and that is to make people continue to believe in those dangerous but invisible viruses, so that virus scares can be reinvigorated whenever the monsters feel they need it. Finally, 3, the final question we ask is, how dangerous are the measures? Extremely dangerous, as we now know. Millions of small and medium-sized businesses were destroyed so that Amazon and others could step in and take over their businesses. By the way, pretty much all of those Silicon Valley startups were in reality started up by the CIA through their investment vehicle In-Q-Tel, which usually funded 30% so that Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos, they could all get their businesses going, but under the controlling influence of the CIA. But of course, the physical and psychological damage done by the experimental shots to billions of humans is immeasurable. As of 2022, Professor Denis Rancourt and Dr. Roger Hodkinson from Canada, the latter a pathologist and a PCR test maker and a very outspoken critic of the measures, reported at least 20 million deaths. This is in 2022. At least 20 million deaths due to the shots and more than 2.4 billion serious, really serious adverse events. But back to the Corona Investigative Committee. At any rate, after 2 scientists, a professor of economy and a professor of medicine, an expert on vaccines, whom Viviane Fischer had wanted to join the Corona Committee, declined to join us, Viviane Fischer insisted that we should be 4 people on our panel asking our experts all those questions. In lieu of real, well-known, and experienced lawyers who all refused to come on board, I turned to 2 inexperienced attorneys whom I had met at Transparency International and who, despite their obvious shortcomings, I hoped would be kept under control by their mentor, my friend Professor Dr. Martin Schwab. They agreed, and so we held our press conference on July 10th, 2020, and immediately went to work, live streaming show after show after show. And from July 2020 until September of 2022, we interviewed more than 400 people, conducted more than 400 interviews. Sometimes we interviewed people twice, maybe. Right from the start, the work of the Corona Investigative Committee was an enormous success. Thousands of people, then hundreds of thousands of people, and then millions of people watched our shows all over the world. Many of them, as I gather from the thousands of letters and postcards I've received while in prison, told me that they had instinctively felt that there was something wrong with the alleged pandemic, and that they felt reassured through our interviews. They learned that there definitely was not just something, but everything wrong, and that therefore they refused to take the shots. And in many cases, they were even successful in convincing their friends and relatives to not take the shots. Also, right from the start, we were getting thousands of emails and hundreds of letters from our viewers and donors, and ultimately, by September of 2022, some, if I remember correctly, 3.8 million euros in donations had come in. So while we created our website, no, not we, Viviane Fischer created our website and hired a friend from Poland to be our IT man, and another friend and his firm called Oval Media to film and live stream our shows. I hired a bookkeeper so that we would not be exposed on that front in case the state, the so-called state, checked into our books. A manager to organize our shows and to discuss with me and to prepare the shows, to discuss with me and our bookkeeper, a friend and client of mine, every Monday what guests we would be interviewing on Fridays. And seeing that Viviane Fischer was too chaotic, she claims she's very creative. I thought she's very chaotic, too chaotic to be able to handle all the mail coming in, while at the same time realizing that we must closely communicate with our viewers and donors. I ordered my firm to take over, much to the dismay of my attorneys and our bookkeeper, who wanted us to focus on the real cases, that is, the cases against Deutsche Bank that were waiting for us. The clients were waiting for us to file those complaints for them. But I thought it was more than appropriate to take over the communication, because most of the people whose emails and letters and attempts to call someone at the Corona Investigative Committee and whose attempts to connect were left unanswered had turned to my firm, because my firm and I had been around for almost 30 years, and we had, unlike Viviane Fischer and the other two on our panel, a track record of success, which was noted even by the mainstream media, and a German news magazine had voted us one of the top, 3 or so German law firms for consumer protection. And since I was regarded as the face of the Corona Committee, it was only logical that people turned to my firm in Göttingen when they realized that there was no one answering their attempts at communicating with the Corona Committee in Berlin. The senior attorney at my firm in Germany, the woman who had been helping me run the firm when I was in the U.S., and my IT manager, put together an email in which they explained to Viviane Fischer that 25,000 euros a month for this job was hardly enough, considering that we answered some 320,000 emails, hundreds of pieces of real mail, that's snail mail, and hundreds of phone calls over the course of 2 years. My senior attorney got up at 4:30 every morning to make sure that everyone would get their fair share of work, and we had to install a new server to deal with that massive amount of communication of that traffic. What struck me and Viviane Fischer as pretty weird, however, is that right from the start, the two substitute members of the Corona Committee showed absolutely no interest in our work, only showed up whenever it pleased them, sometimes even left in the middle of a show claiming that they had to tend to some urgent legal matter. Even more weird was that their partner in their 3-lawyer firm tried everything to join the Corona Committee when the man who later wrote the criminal complaint against me, Justus Hoffmann, due to serious mental issues, turned out to not be fit for the job. He sometimes disappeared completely for many weeks, and so that other guy was trying to get Viviane Fischer and me to let him come aboard as a substitute for that now disappeared other guy. We declined. Then, in November of 2020, we were informed by an American journalist by the name of James Henry, who published excellent interviews on Telegram under the heading of Planet Lockdown, and who had come to do an interview with me in Berlin. he informed us that Professor Zusharit Bhakti's group's bank accounts had been seized by the deep state. We needed to do something so that this wouldn't happen to us too. This turned out to be a false alarm, but it led to Viviane Fischer and me taking out a couple of loans in order to protect part of the donations from getting seized. Because if that had happened to us, we would effectively be shut down, and we wouldn't be able to pay for the translators, the managers, the bookkeeper, our IT manager, the film crew that filmed and live streamed our shows, and of course for communications. So we, Viviane Fischer and I, signed official loan contracts and had them transparently listed in the Corona Committee's books. Even though the weird substitute members of the Corona Committee, who had become weirder by the day, had not cared about anything, we, that is Viviane Fischer and I did, had not helped with anything that needed to be done, including communications, bookkeeping, IT, website management, etc. I visited them and their partner in crime at their weird one-room law firm and told them about this. But they weren't even interested in that. A few months later, in August of 2021, Viviane Fischer and I had a real falling out with them, as it turned out that the only thing they were really interested in were donations, money. In fact, one of them, the guy who later wrote that criminal complaint, Justus Hoffmann, even demanded to be paid for his rare participation in our shows. What neither of us, neither myself nor, I believe, Viviane Fischer knew at the time, is that the other substitute member of the Corona Committee, a woman, had been working for one of the branches of the German Domestic Intelligence Service since right after she had graduated from law school. And what we didn't know at all and didn't expect is that their partner in crime, the third man, had co-founded a union, an alternative union for the members of the resistance, which was really a front for the Domestic Intelligence Service, through which they were hoping to get to know the identities of the German resistance's activists. There's much more about that third man who stole my money. It's still in his bank account, or he may have given it to the deep state. I don't know. But really, really dark stuff. I will not talk about it now, but you'll hear about it later. At any rate, Viviane Fischer and I were more than happy to have gotten rid of all three of them on that day in August of 2021, but they reappeared one more time in December of 2021, asking Viviane Fischer and me for a settlement agreement that would have paid them half the donations in exchange for them not causing us any more problems. For example, they said they would make the internal fights we had had with them public. This settlement agreement, they claimed, had been set up with the help of their protector, the man who I thought was my friend, Professor Schwab, whose name they dropped 8 times in that draft agreement. When I called him, Professor Schwab, about this, actually he admitted that he had helped them with that. I couldn't believe it, and neither could Viviane Fischer, and we both told all of them to go to hell. Unbeknownst to me, the Domestic Intelligence Agency, CPA, and the German equivalent of the FBI, the BKA, had me in their sights since August of 2021. That is, since at least the time of Viviane Fischer and my altercation with those 3 Berlin attorneys. After my abduction in Mexico and incarceration for pretrial detention, I read in the prosecution's case file about this. Then my attorney, Dr. Christoph Miseray, presented the court and us, of course, with the dossier that he had been given by a whistleblower from the BND, which is the Foreign Intelligence Service, and it's the equivalent of the CIA. It's a dossier compiled on me by the Domestic Intelligence Service and the BKA, that's the equivalent of the FBI, and it tells us exactly at what time they started to observe me in August of 2021. Also unbeknownst to me, the Domestic Intelligence Service had in late 2021 directly written to the Göttingen DA's office and asked them to invent a crime, any crime. For example, they suggested fraud or violation of a fiduciary duty, which is a catch-all crime invented by the Nazis to take their political opponents out of circulation, so that I could then be charged with that crime and be sentenced to a very long prison term so that I would not be able to run for public office. You know, at that time, I had been the leader of a political party, the only political party that was very, very critical of the measures, and they had voted me to be their candidate for the chancellorship in 2022. But something went wrong. Their request to take me down landed on the desk of probably the one Göttingen prosecutor who was still trying to uphold the rule of law, Senior Prosecutor Reinicke. She launched a detailed preliminary investigation, even watched our shows and checked out our website, and then refused to even open a full criminal investigation. On June 14th, 2022, she explained in her order to throw the case out and have it archived, that is, put into storage, that there was absolutely nothing criminal about anything we and I had done. She said that what I had done, or we had done, is exactly what we had promised our donors to do: investigate the pandemic and gather evidence so that could then be used to hold those to account who were responsible for the suspension of each and every one of the most basic articles of the German Constitution. In fact, this, a thorough legal investigation of the pandemic, is exactly what the highly regarded former president of Germany's Constitutional Court, Professor Hans-Jürgen Papier, had demanded for months and is still demanding, because he insists the legal system, and in particular the Constitutional Court, that should have protected the Constitution, had failed the German people on all fronts. Prosecutor Reinicke even went so far as to tell the Corona Protection Agency that she would not simply follow orders and start a criminal investigation without there being even a shred of evidence of a crime having been committed. This is extremely important because German prosecutors, as has become common knowledge since 2019, must follow orders, including orders from politicians, and that is why on May 27th, 2019, the European Supreme Court had decided that German prosecutors cannot and must not issue European arrest warrants, simply because there's always the danger that some politician ordered them to start a criminal proceeding against a political opponent. So what this woman had done is basically tell the CPA, the German Domestic Intelligence Service, to go to hell and shove it, except that she did this in legal terminology. But this, of course, was not what the CPA had expected her to do. Now they were forced to throw a kind of a Hail Mary pass and use true idiots for this last-ditch effort. And this is how that happened. A lot of friction had been building up between Viviane Fischer and me because I resented her chaotic activities, her inability to come prepared into our shows, and her inability to even finish her sometimes bizarre sentences. That's why on August the 26th, this is August 26th of 2022, I wrote her an email telling her that I and Inka would go back to the States, but that I was going to continue working with her for the Corona Investigative Committee, as I considered this to be an enormously important project through which we had been gathering extremely useful and important information to be used in the legal proceedings which I was envisioning to hold the perpetrators of the crimes against humanity to account. And I said that I was in the process of paying back the loan before I left because I thought there was no more danger anymore. I was wrong, but still. I told her that we were selling our last piece of real property in Germany and that I already had a buyer who had made a firm offer of at least 1.3 million euros, which was more than enough to pay back the loan of, I think, 700,000. Then something totally irrational even insane happened. For reasons that I still haven't been able to figure out, Viviane Fischer forwarded that email of August 26, 2022, to the 3 attorneys turned agents for the deep state whom she and I had kicked off the Corona Committee only a year earlier. She once said in an interview that Wolfgang Wodak had prompted her to do that, but who knows if this is true. This, however, is how the German Domestic Intelligence Service got wind of this and the fact that I was in the process of paying back the loan, and they panicked because if I paid back the loan, there wouldn't be anything that they could pin on me to take me down. So a week later, on September the 2nd, 2022, the 3 Berlin attorneys turned deep state agents filed a hastily written criminal complaint against me with the Göttingen DA's office. Coincidentally, or maybe in coordination with that criminal complaint, on that very same day, Viviane Fischer and Wolfgang Wodak started a public smear campaign against me. In order to be able to do this without me being present and responding to this, they told me that on that day, the show that was scheduled to take place had to be rescheduled. There wouldn't be a show because our manager's wife was having her second child. That was a lie, as it turned out, but it made it possible for them to start accusing me of all kinds of things, culminating in Viviane Fischer's accusation that because of me, the children of the people who were working for the Corona Committee were dying of hunger. She insinuated that because of the loan I had taken, there was no money to pay for them. That was wrong, of course, not just because she knew that I was in the process of paying back the loan, but also because even the prosecution's case file shows that there was more than enough money left in our bank account, and there was more than 1 million euros in gold I had purchased for the Corona Committee to safely protect our donations from the state's efforts to seize them. So why did she lie? Who did she do this for? And why did she all of a sudden cooperate with the 3 Berlin attorneys turned deep state agents? We'll find out. But this second time around, the fact that this is really a political persecution is even more obvious than the first time around, because page number 1 of the new case file, which usually informs the reader of the crime the accused is charged with, something like theft, fraud, or murder, this time around, there was only one word, and that is Corona. Now, if that isn't a smoking gun, I don't know what is. At any rate, there was one more problem that the Domestic Intelligence Service had to take care of, and that was that senior prosecutor, Reinicke. Because once again, that new case had landed on her desk as she was in charge of cases brought against attorneys. And she, seeing that nothing had changed since her ruling 2.5 months earlier, her ruling of June 14th, was about to once again refuse to start a criminal investigation against me. In order to bypass her, the Domestic Intelligence Service had a young and inexperienced prosecutor by the name of John transferred from Hanover to Göttingen and had the case number changed so that now he, instead of her, was in charge. Still, one senior police investigator and a senior prosecutor agreed in writing, there's a note in the case file, that the 3 attorneys from Berlin who had written and filed the criminal complaint against me, and also Viviane Fischer as their tipper, needed to be interrogated by the police. The senior police investigator found the strangely and amateurishly written criminal complaint so weird that he decided he had to look into the people who were responsible for this. Because among other things, the author of the complaint, of the criminal complaint, Justus Hoffmann, the other signed, but he's the author, accused me of having threatened him with a Winchester rifle because, he says, and he later confirmed this in court, he was an Ashkenazi Jew. That was not only ridiculous, and false, as I didn't even own a Winchester rifle, and neither Viviana Fischer nor I had even been aware of his religious affiliation. Neither did we care about this. But Prosecutor John didn't care about any of these weird things and didn't investigate anything. And, of course, he never questioned that man, Justus Hoffmann. Rather, he simply filled in an arrest warrant form and had a Joe Biden-like judge auto-sign this on March 15, 2023. At the same time, he seized my wife's bank account, although she had nothing to do with anything, including her disability payments. Up until the seizure of her bank account, we had been totally unaware of what was going on in Göttingen. But when Inka realized that there was no disability pay coming in, we knew that something was very wrong. We had two of my attorneys at the firm inquire in writing what was going on, asking the Göttingen DA's office on what basis they were coming after Inka and presumably me too. Prosecutor John, illegally of course, refused to give them any info, claiming that he was investigating them too. When a little later, an outside attorney from Munich, whom Inka had hired to find out what was going on, was told by John that he was too busy to give her any info, we finally knew in late May of 2023 or so that something was very, very wrong. But before we finally woke up to that fact, something strange happened. In early March of 2023, Professor Martin Schwab, whose protégés had stolen almost all of our money, with the help of Prosecutor John, by the way, who protected them, he wrote to me, not John, but Professor Martin Schwab, he wrote to me an email asking if I was okay with him taking thousands of euros of the money that his protégés had stolen from me and that was sitting in their Berlin bank account so that he could use that money to give it to a friend of his who was in financial trouble. I almost exploded with rage and then once again calmly explained to him in great detail how they had in fact stolen my money from me, lying to and threatening the buyer of our home that if he didn't agree to paying the purchase price to them instead of Inka and me, as it should have been paid because that's what the sales contract says, they would foreclose on his house and that he wouldn't be able to move in for a long time. Justus Hoffmann even bragged about this in a chat he sent to Viviane Fischer, which she then published. So Martin Schwab, who seemed to not be able to wrap his head around the fact that he was protecting people who were not just criminals, but also working for the deep state, finally understood or seemed to understood and sent me an email explaining that he would use his own money to pay for whatever his friend needed because, as he said, and I quote, "I do not want to be guilty of embezzling your money." A couple of weeks later, Professor Martin Schwab approached me again. This is in late March of 2023. Calling me to tell me that the three Berlin attorneys, his friends and protégés, and also Viviane Fischer were ready to settle with me. I responded by telling him that there really wasn't anything to settle, as I simply wanted the money back that they had stolen from me, but that, in order to speed things up, I was willing to give all four of them access to the gold stored at a bank in Berlin for the Corona Committee in both Viviane Fischer's and my name. I had already filed a motion for a preliminary judgment against the three Berlin attorneys asking the court to seize their bank account with our money in it, but I decided that if we could quickly settle the case, that would go much faster than having to engage in a possibly lengthy court battle over this. Surprisingly, however, the settlement negotiations that should have been resolved within 24 hours dragged on for weeks and then months. As we now know, and as both former substitute members of the Corona Committee admitted in court later, they had been working with the deep state and in particular with Prosecutor John in order to find out about my whereabouts and to get me arrested. The settlement negotiations were a ploy, fake, that only served that purpose, they said in court. A little later, in July of 2023, one morning, Inka and I woke up to find that both our passports had mysteriously disappeared. I called the German embassy in Mexico City and explained what had happened, that they were either stolen or that we had lost them. And they told me that we would both have to fly to Tijuana to meet with the honorary consul there and fill in a couple of forms based on which we would get new passports. So that's what we did. And we met there with the honorary consul, who, after learning who I was, asked me about getting medical help so that he would be able to get rid of the toxins that he feared were in his body because of the corona shots he had taken. Then, a few weeks later, the passports reappeared as mysteriously as they had disappeared a few weeks earlier. So I called the embassy again to tell them that we didn't need the passports after all, the new passports. But they said it was too late, as both passports, they claimed, had been annulled or voided already, so that we would have to once again fly to Tijuana to pick up the new passports. Friends warned us not to do this, as this made no sense. Why would they not simply send the new passport by FedEx or UPS? However, we didn't heed those warnings and flew to Tijuana. As we now know from the prosecution's case file, which contains almost all of the email exchanges, not all of them, but almost all of the email exchanges between the Göttingen DA's office, the Hanover field office of the equivalent of the FBI on the one hand, and the FBI agent stationed in Mexico City. This was going to turn into what is now an international incident and what is ultimately going to blow the entire German government out of the water, the deep state government. In this exchange, in this email exchange, the Germans asked their colleague in Mexico City, to, and I quote directly, to lure me and Inka to Tijuana under the pretext of us needing to provide signatures for our new passports so that the Germans could have us arrested by the Mexicans, The BKA officer in Mexico City replied, however, that it was impossible to have us arrested and that was only possible based on a Mexican arrest warrant, which of course didn't exist and wouldn't be issued anyways, as we had neither entered the country illegally nor had we committed any crimes in Mexico. Therefore, he advised the Germans in Germany over and over and over again to start official diplomatic extradition proceedings. That, however, the Germans didn't want to do, as this would have guaranteed me a fair hearing so that I could respond to the totally false charges of illegal loans in their arrest warrant, in their fake arrest warrant. Despite the BKA officer in Mexico's repeated warnings to go through the normal extradition proceedings, they insisted that I should be lured to Mexico and get arrested by the Mexicans there, and they insisted that the Mexicans make this look like a deportation by the Mexicans. So that's what happened. Inka and I flew to Tijuana on October the 11th, 2023, and were arrested immediately by 5 or 6 armed and uniformed Mexican migration officers, and then whisked off full speed, sirens blaring, to the Mexican migration agency located some 20 minutes from the airport. They were really nice to us, but no one was able to tell us what was going on and what we were charged with, not even the director of the agency or his deputy, both of whom apologized for the inconvenience they were causing us when we arrived there, telling us that it wasn't them, the Mexicans, who were behind this, but the Germans. I always said the Germans, meaning obviously that the German embassy had asked them to arrest us. So I called the embassy in Mexico City. The call was answered by a woman who fidgeted audibly, kept telling us that she didn't know what was going on, that she couldn't help us. When I then asked her to provide us with an attorney for protection, which she should have and must have done, she said that wasn't possible either, and that I should get in touch with the honorary consul in Tijuana, with whom we had agreed to meet anyway because of the new passports. So I called him. But he responded in the same manner, trying to wiggle his way out of this, for him, very uncomfortable situation, explaining that he didn't know what was going on either and that he couldn't help us either. Then a fax arrived, and the two migration officers, whom we thought were the director and the deputy director of the Tijuana Migration Authority, told us once again that it wasn't the Mexicans who were responsible, as they had absolutely no reason to arrest us because we had neither entered the country illegally nor had we committed a crime in Mexico. Rather, he said, it was the Germans, as they repeated over and over again, who wanted to get me. Unfortunately, the director continued, he had to send me back to Germany accompanied by two of his officers. But first, he asked me if I was okay with him taking a picture of me with his private cell phone. I said, sure, why not, sensing that that man was trying to help me in some way. And indeed, October 14th, when I was already in Germany, an article appeared in a Mexican newspaper with the picture he had taken of me, explaining that the well-known international lawyer Dr. Reiner Fuellmich was arrested in Tijuana because the Germans wanted him because of his work investigating the COVID pandemic. Inca, whose alleged passport problems were the same as mine, could stay in Mexico, but was kept at that migration center for another day, as she later told me. She cried, of course, when I was taken away then, and on the orders of the Germans, she had to stay there for one more day. Also following the Germans' orders, they took her cell phone and locked her up in a cell for a night so that she wouldn't be able to call an attorney for help. That would have immediately stopped the entire kidnapping process. I landed in Frankfurt, Germany, on October 13th, where I was presented for the very first time with that fake arrest warrant. The police officer who had me sign an arrest protocol had added something she called a special remark that was right below my signature, explaining that this was an extradition accompanied by two Mexican migration officers. I told her that that was not true, but that it had been an outright kidnapping. She said that she didn't know about that, but that she did know that there was something wrong, as she had not received any documentation of the alleged extradition. That's why, she explained, she had added that special remark. If it should ever come to that, to a legal proceeding over this, she would testify to this in my favor, she said. At that point, it was clear to me that this was an outright kidnapping or abduction disguised by the Germans as a deportation and simultaneously as an extradition. We know that it was neither, because in 2023, I think it was the BKA confirmed to my friend journalist Roger Bittel, no, not a single one extradition had been conducted. So this very journalist friend, Roger Bittel, who later doggedly tried to get all the German agencies involved in this to send them a full documentation of how the Germans had gotten me out of Mexico, finally received a 22-page dossier from the German Department of the Interior with a BKA file on me, FBI file on me. However, we couldn't read any of this, as three-quarters of this was completely blacked out. He also received a letter explaining that this information was classified, as this information could result in serious damage to the diplomatic relations with another country. Obviously, they were talking about Mexico. Now, if this isn't a smoking gun, I don't know. On October 18th, 2023, I arrived at Rostov Prison, a maximum security prison near Göttingen. The court in Göttingen kept withholding parts of the prosecution's case file from us, but in late December, early 2024, the hastily put together proceeding against me started. However, by late April of 2024, it had become clear even to the deep state's puppet by the name of Schindler, who presided over the 5-judge panel, that the charges were fake, that the loan was perfectly in accordance with corporate law, and that I had always been both willing and able to pay back the loan, but couldn't after the three authors and signatories of the criminal complaint, with the help of Prosecutor John, had stolen almost all of our money. But instead of him throwing the case out and letting me go, on May 3rd, 2024, he invented completely new charges, now claiming, out of thin air that is, now claiming that I was no longer accused of illegal loans, but of having violated a secret agreement that I had entered into with Viviane Fischer. Unfortunately, that secret agreement, he said, didn't exist in writing. And he added it had not even been entered into orally. Obviously, this is absolutely impossible under the applicable civil law, and we, but also the audience in the courtroom, were outraged, requesting the judge to give us enough time to prepare for this brand new factual situation and then name witnesses to refute those bizarre and idiotic new accusations. The judge refused and stated that he had heard enough and that we should now prepare for our closing arguments. We kept filing motion after motion to hear the defense's witnesses because none of our witnesses had been heard up until then, so that we could refute the new, again, absolutely insane allegations. But he refused. When he then realized that I had understood that this was not a real criminal proceeding, but a highly criminal proceeding presided over by criminal judges and prosecutors from the deep state, that I was now in charge of my defense, advising my defense team as to what kind of strategy we should follow. He had the concentration camp style maximum security prison at Rostov subject me to 6 months of the most excessive measures of white torture. I'm calling this a concentration camp-like prison because I actually told this to the director of that prison, Dr. Jacobs, who claims that she is a psychologist, but as far as I'm concerned, and I told her so, is merely a psychopath. They perform all kinds of medical and psychological experiments on the unwitting inmates there, which I will detail when I'm out of here. I just got another letter from one of the inmates there. It's still going on. In my case, eventually, even some of the correctional officers volunteered to testify in my favor, as they said that no one had ever been treated like me before, not even the most violent offenders that had been at that prison. Among other things, Schindler had me put in solitary confinement for 6 months. The so-called security department constantly threatened me with guns and machine guns when I was transferred between the prison and the court. I was not allowed to see my dying mother one last time, and then not even allowed to be at her funeral after she died. They placed paranoid schizophrenics in the cell next to mine so that I wouldn't be able to sleep and prepare for the next day's hearing, etc., etc. After 6 months, that ended with them explaining that this had been necessary, in writing, by the way, that this had been necessary because, among other things, I had spoken to Muslims too often, and I had given legal advice to fellow inmates. Then, on April 24th, 2025, the court, under the direction of Judge Schindler, sentenced me to 4 years and 2 months in prison for having violated a secret agreement which no one knows what it says, when it was entered into, and who is bound by it. That's when I started to fight back, writing a 166-page long criminal complaint against the judges, prosecutors, and others, and then a more than 40-page long civil complaint for civil damages. And I informed the Supreme Court, where our appeal is pending and ready to be ruled upon any day now, about both, so that they would know what had really happened in my case. This was an outright kidnapping for political persecution and a deliberate circumvention of the official diplomatic extradition process, and this, in accordance with both the constitutional courts and the Supreme Court's rulings, translates directly into what both call an extreme outlier case. Extreme outlier case. And the consequence of this extreme outlier case is twofold. One, an immediate and final prohibition to incarcerate, and two, an immediate and final prohibition to prosecute. Times have changed. The dark powers of the deep state are gone. They have exhausted their powers. And Germany's economy and its society is collapsing as a result of the deep state's puppets' actions. And now, even though many judges and prosecutors who have seen how the rule of law has been all but abolished, but have remained silent out of fear, are beginning to understand that anyone, including one of them, could be next if they keep their radio silence. That is what I'm counting on. And that, in combination with the massive international support I have been getting, is now turning the tide and will get me out of here. One question seems to not have been adequately answered. What about the money? Well, it's all there, either in the Berlin attorneys/deep state agents' bank account or in the deep state's coffers. And the gold, which has at least doubled in value since we bought it, is still in the vaults of the Berlin bank where Viviane Fischer and I put it. But the 3 Berlin attorneys/deep state agents are trying to get to that too. They will not be successful. So that's the whole story. If you want to know the details, please check either the criminal complaint or the civil complaint. When I get out, I'll make absolutely sure that all the perpetrators of the crimes against humanity that have been committed against all of us, not just me, will be brought to justice, regardless of where they're hiding, and that everything they stole from us over the past decades or centuries will be returned to us. I'm sure when they own nothing and sit in jail, they'll be more than happy. Thank you, my friends.